Britain did not become rich by accident. It became rich quietly. While wars burned continents and empires collapsed in public, Britain learned something far more dangerous than military power. It learned how to make money invisible. By the early 20th century, Britain controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Yet its greatest strength was not territory or armies. It was paperwork, contracts, banks, insurance, shipping registries, legal language so complex it could turn violence into profit without ever firing a shot. That is the uncomfortable truth behind Britain's hidden wealth. It was never just about colonies. It was about systems that survived long after the empire officially died. At the height of its power, Britain did not need to steal openly. It built rules that made extraction look legal. Raw materials flowed in. Gold flowed through London. Profits flowed out to private hands. And when independence movements finally forced Britain to retreat, the money did not leave with the flags. It stayed. It stayed in banks, trusts, offshore accounts, and corporate structures that still exist today. Empires fall loudly. Financial systems don't. They whisper, they adapt, and they keep collecting. London became the center of this quiet machine, not because it produced the most goods, but because it controlled the flow of capital. Insurance markets decided which ships sailed and which never left port. British banks financed railways abroad and collected interest long after local governments collapsed. The City of London, a square mile with its own laws and privileges, became more powerful than entire nations. It did not answer to voters. It answered to money, and that money was global. Here is the twist most people miss. When Britain's empire officially ended, its financial reach actually expanded. Former colonies gained flags and anthems, but their debts were still denominated in pounds. Their trade still ran through British institutions. Their elites were trained in British schools and deposited wealth in British banks. Independence changed the politics. It did not change the balance sheet. Within the first minute of this story, let me say this clearly, if you want to understand modern inequality, modern tax avoidance, and modern financial secrecy, you must understand Britain. And if this kind of deep, uncomfortable history matters to you, subscribe now. This channel exists to explain the systems most people are never taught. And every week, we go further into stories that power prefers stay buried. Britain perfected something more effective than conquest. It perfected intermediation. It placed itself between producers and profits, between risk and reward, between labor and capital. Even today, a massive percentage of global wealth passes through British-linked jurisdictions without ever touching Britain itself. That is not a coincidence. That is design. The story begins much earlier than modern finance. It begins with trade monopolies like the East India Company, which blurred the line between corporation and government. This was not just a business. It had its own army, its own courts, and the power to tax millions. It extracted wealth at a scale never seen before, then routed that wealth back through London. When the company eventually collapsed under corruption and rebellion, the British state absorbed its structures, its debts, and its methods. The empire learned from its own experiment. By the late 19th century, Britain no longer needed companies to rule directly. It needed banks. It needed insurers. It needed legal systems that could enforce contracts across oceans. British courts became the place where global disputes were settled. British law became the default language of commerce. This meant that even when Britain was not involved in a deal, it still earned from it. Now here is where the story turns darker. Wealth did not just accumulate, it concentrated. A small class learned how to protect it across generations. Trusts were created to avoid taxes. Shell companies were formed to hide ownership. Assets were spread across jurisdictions designed to reveal nothing. These tools were not created by criminals. They were created by professionals, lawyers, accountants, bankers, many of them trained in Britain, operating under British law. Fast forward to the 20th century. 2 world wars nearly bankrupted Britain. The country sold assets, borrowed heavily, and lost its empire piece by piece. On the surface, Britain looked weaker. But behind the scenes, its financial network adjusted. Offshore financial centers tied to Britain expanded rapidly. Places like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and Jersey became vaults for global wealth. They offered secrecy, low taxes, and legal protection, all under the quiet umbrella of British influence. This is where modern Britain's hidden wealth truly lives. Not on the streets of London, but in spreadsheets no voter will ever see. Trillions of dollars move through British-linked tax havens every year. Money from oil states, corporations, oligarchs, and elites from every continent. Britain may no longer rule the world politically, but it still hosts the plumbing of global wealth. And here is the uncomfortable question we will keep circling. If Britain is no longer an empire, why does so much of the world's money still flow through it? In the next part, we will trace how this system accelerated after the fall of the empire. How Britain reinvented itself as a financial hub for the world's richest people, and how hidden wealth became more powerful than visible power ever was. Money never disappears, it only changes shape. When Britain's empire collapsed on paper, its financial system didn't weaken, it evolved. The flags came down, the colonies became nations, the headlines spoke of decline, but the money kept moving, quietly, legally, invisibly. This is where Britain's hidden wealth became more powerful than its empire ever was. After World War II, Britain was drowning in debt. Cities were destroyed, industries were broken. The government borrowed heavily from the United States. On the surface, Britain looked like a declining power. But behind closed doors, a new strategy was forming. Britain would stop ruling land and start controlling flows. Capital flows, trade flows, influence without borders. The City of London became the engine of this transformation. Not London as a city, the city as a legal entity, a financial zone with its own governance structure, its own rules, and centuries-old privileges. While politicians debated rebuilding the nation, the city focused on rebuilding networks, banking networks, legal networks, offshore networks. The empire had been physical. The new system would be digital, contractual, and untouchable. Here's the turning point. Britain helped create a web of offshore financial centers that functioned like extensions of its financial system. They were not technically Britain, but they were legally tied to it. Jurisdictions like Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man, these places offered something powerful: secrecy, protection, and zero accountability. Wealth could be parked there, moved through there, hidden there, and protected by British legal frameworks. This wasn't random, it was systematic. Corporations could register shell companies. Billionaires could hide ownership. Politicians could move money. Criminals could clean money. Everything looked legal because the system itself was legal. That's the most dangerous kind of system, one that doesn't need crime to function. As Britain lost factories, it gained financial dominance. Manufacturing jobs disappeared, but financial profits exploded. Banking, insurance, asset management, and legal services replaced industry. Britain stopped producing goods and started producing structures that move money. The world followed. Corporations listed in London, foreign governments borrowed from British banks. International contracts used British law, disputes were settled in British courts. Even when money had nothing to do with Britain, Britain still earned from it. Fees, interest, legal services, management, insurance. And here's the darker layer. Britain became a safe harbor for global elite wealth. Not just honest wealth, all wealth. Oligarch money, resource money, dictator money, corruption money. As long as it came through the right channels, it was welcome. Luxury property became vaults. Mansions weren't homes, they were storage units for capital. London real estate turned into a financial product, not a living space. Entire neighborhoods became empty shells, lights off, curtains closed. Owned by companies registered in tax havens, linked to trusts hidden behind legal walls. Britain didn't just host wealth, it protected it. This is how hidden wealth becomes untouchable, not because it's invisible, but because it's layered. Ownership is buried under corporations. Corporations are buried under trusts. Trusts are buried under jurisdictions. Jurisdictions are protected by legal systems. Try to trace it, and the trail dissolves into paperwork. Now connect this to modern reality. While ordinary people pay taxes directly from their salaries, the richest people don't. Their money moves through structures: offshore vehicles, asset vehicles, investment funds, shell corporations. The system rewards complexity. The more complex your finances, the less visible your wealth becomes. Britain didn't invent this, but it perfected it. The rise of financialization changed the nature of wealth itself. Wealth stopped being factories, land, and labor. It became data, derivatives, ownership rights, financial instruments, and Britain positioned itself as the center of that world. The breaking point didn't come with a single crash, it came slowly. Trust in institutions eroded. Inequality exploded. The gap between visible society and hidden wealth widened. People felt poorer while markets grew richer. Governments struggled while financial markets boomed. The system became disconnected from real life. This is the moment where hidden wealth becomes dangerous, because it stops serving society and starts feeding itself. And here's the truth that's rarely spoken. Britain's hidden wealth system doesn't exist for citizens. It exists for capital. It doesn't protect people. It protects assets. It doesn't reward labor. It rewards ownership. It doesn't serve democracy. It serves financial stability for the rich. In the next part, we go even deeper. We expose how this system shapes global politics, modern inequality, and modern power. We connect Britain's hidden wealth to today's economic instability, public debt, housing crises, and collapsing trust in institutions. And we answer the hardest question of all. If wealth is hidden this well, who is really in control? The final layer of Britain's hidden wealth is not money. It is power without responsibility. When wealth becomes abstract, mobile, and legally shielded, it no longer answers to voters, borders, or even governments. It answers only to preservation. And that is where the modern system quietly breaks. By the early 2000s, Britain had become a global referee for money disputes it never created. Russian oligarchs fought legal battles in London courts. African resource deals were structured through British law firms. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth flowed through British banks. Asian corporations parked profits in British-linked havens. Britain was no longer a player on the field. It was the rule book. This gave Britain something rare in a declining empire: leverage without visibility. When a country depends on your legal system, your currency, your courts, and your financial expertise, you don't need to threaten it. Influence becomes automatic. Decisions made thousands of miles away still pass through British structures. That is silent power. But this system came with a cost that only became visible much later. When capital has no loyalty, it also has no obligation. Wealth flows toward safety, not society. And Britain optimized itself for safety, for wealth, not for people. Look at housing. London became one of the most expensive cities in the world, not because of local demand, but because global capital needed somewhere stable to sit. Apartments became assets. Homes became numbers. Prices disconnected from wages. Ordinary people were priced out, not by neighbors, but by invisible owners who never planned to live there. Look at taxation. Governments told citizens to tighten belts, accept austerity, and work longer. At the same time, trillions moved through offshore structures, legally minimizing taxes. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, just not for the majority. Look at democracy. When political parties rely on donors whose wealth is hidden behind structures, accountability weakens. When media companies are owned by opaque entities, narratives bend. When lobbying is funded by interests that never appear on balance sheets, public policy drifts away from public good. This is the moment where the illusion cracks. Because democracy assumes visible power, but modern financial power is invisible by design. Britain didn't create corruption. It created infrastructure. Infrastructure that allows wealth to operate beyond scrutiny. And once that infrastructure exists, it cannot be easily dismantled without collapsing the system that now depends on it. Every attempt at reform hits the same wall. If Britain closes one loophole, capital moves to another jurisdiction. If transparency increases, wealth threatens to leave. Governments fear capital flight more than inequality. So reforms are announced loudly and implemented quietly, carefully, slowly, often symbolically. Meanwhile, the patterns repeat. The rich get richer, assets inflate, debt grows, productivity stagnates, trust erodes. People sense the imbalance even if they can't name it. They feel that the rules are different for them, and they are right. This isn't just Britain's story anymore. It's the global story. Britain was the prototype. Others copied it. Offshore finance expanded, financialization spread, wealth concentrated. And now the system is too large to control, too complex to unwind, and too profitable to challenge. The danger is not collapse. The danger is permanence, a system where inequality becomes normalized, where ownership replaces contribution, where financial survival matters more than social stability. And yet, history tells us something important. Systems that prioritize capital over society eventually face backlash. Not always through revolutions, sometimes through slow decay, falling birth rates, mental health crises, political extremism, institutional paralysis. When people feel excluded from the system, they stop believing in it. So what does this mean for you? First takeaway: wealth today is not just about money. It is about structure. Who controls the rules matters more than who earns the income. Second takeaway: transparency is power. The less visible a system is, the harder it is to challenge and the easier it is to abuse. Third takeaway: hidden wealth doesn't disappear. It reshapes societies quietly, slowly, until the effects are impossible to ignore. The open question is not whether this system will change, it's how. Gradually through reform or violently through crisis, history offers both paths. None are painless. If you've made it this far, you already sense something deeper is happening beneath the headlines. And that awareness matters, because systems survive on silence, not scrutiny. If this video gave you a new way to see power, wealth, and influence, make sure you're subscribed to Fiscora Empire. This channel exists to expose the structures behind the stories we're told. Share this video with someone who still thinks money is just numbers in a bank. And in the comments, tell us what you think is the most dangerous part of hidden wealth: secrecy, inequality, or control. Because the moment people start asking better questions is the moment invisible power starts to weaken.